A stone can sit unnoticed for decades, handled, traded, even worn, without anyone thinking twice about it. Then something shifts. Not the chemistry, not the structure, not even the rarity, just the way it's seen. And almost instantly, what once felt ordinary starts appearing in places it never did before. Auction rooms, private collections, locked displays, the same object, a completely different value. This doesn't happen often, but when it does, it rarely makes sense at first, because the change doesn't come from the stone itself. It comes from a moment when recognition catches up. In this video, we're not looking at the most expensive gemstones. We're looking at something far less predictable. 10 stones that crossed a line from overlooked to suddenly valuable. Some were misunderstood. Some were misidentified. Some didn't even belong in the category they ended up defining. And by the time the market realized what they were, the shift had already happened. No buildup, no warning. Just a different way of seeing that changed everything. Don't forget to press and hold that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe before we begin. Ranked 10th, Fire Opal, the stone. No one valued until taste changed. At first glance, it doesn't behave like an opal at all. No flashing rainbow, no dramatic play of color that collectors are trained to chase. Just a steady internal glow, like light passing through embers rather than reflecting off a surface. And for a very long time, that difference worked against it. In traditional gemstone markets, value has often been tied to intensity, how much a stone can perform under light. Fire Opal, by contrast, does something quieter. It absorbs attention rather than demanding it. And in a market built on comparison, quiet stones are often misjudged. So for years, it remained in the background. Mined in Mexico, cut into cabochons or faceted stones, sold but rarely celebrated. It was categorized not by what it was, but by what it lacked. No play of color. That single absence defined its place in the hierarchy. But hierarchies in gemstones are never permanent. They shift, sometimes slowly and sometimes all at once. What changed was not supply, not rarity, not even quality. It was taste. As jewelry design evolved, a different kind of value began to emerge. Designers started moving away from maximal brilliance towards something more controlled, more intentional. Color fields became cleaner. Palettes became warmer. Pieces began to rely less on sparkle and more on presence. And suddenly, Fire Opal made sense. That soft internal glow, once dismissed, began to feel refined. The absence of visual noise became an advantage. Instead of competing with light, it held it. Collectors began to notice. Not because the stone was new, but because the way of seeing it was. Within a relatively short window, demand tightened, not through hype, but through alignment. Fire Opal found its place in a design language that finally understood it, and when that happens in the gemstone world, value doesn't rise gradually. It resets. Pieces that once moved quietly through the market began appearing in curated collections. Prices followed, but more importantly, so did respect. The narrative changed. Fire Opal was no longer less than other opals. It became something distinct, a gemstone defined not by brilliance, but by controlled fire. And this is where the idea of overnight value becomes clearer, because the stone itself never changed. No new discovery, no sudden scarcity, no chemical transformation, only perception. And when perception shifts at scale, markets move faster than expected. Fire Opal is not just an example of value increasing, it is an example of value being redefined. Some collectors still believe a gemstone must perform to be valuable. Others look for something quieter, something that holds attention instead of chasing it. Between those two, which one feels more rare? Because in the end, the next gemstone to become valuable overnight may already exist. It's just being seen the wrong way. Ranked 9th, Larimar, the stone that didn't exist until it had a story. At first, it didn't look rare. Soft blue, white streaks, patterns that felt almost too familiar, like shallow water or clouds drifting across a bright sky. It was pleasant, calm, but in a market that rewards intensity and contrast, pleasant is rarely enough. So Larimar remained invisible in plain sight. It was found in only one place on Earth, the Dominican Republic, yet that rarity didn't immediately translate into value. Because rarity only matters when people recognize what they're looking at, and Larimar, for a long time, didn't communicate anything clearly. It didn't demand attention. It didn't compete with brilliance. It didn't explain itself. So it stayed local, sold near beaches, picked up by travelers, treated more like a keepsake than a gemstone, something to remember a place, not something to invest in or collect or study. Outside that environment, it had almost no presence at all. And then something changed, not in the stone, but in the way it was introduced. Instead of being described technically, composition, hardness, origin, Larimar began to be framed differently, not as a mineral, but as an experience. The ocean in stone. A piece of the Caribbean you can hold. Water, frozen in time. Those phrases didn't add value in a material sense, but they removed friction, because suddenly no explanation was needed. The moment someone saw Larimar, the meaning arrived instantly. The color made sense. The patterns felt intentional. It stopped being random and started feeling inevitable. And that is the point where value begins to move. In gemstones, recognition often matters more than rarity. A stone that needs to be explained will always move slower than one that can be understood at a glance. Larimar crossed that threshold. Demand didn't surge overnight in a dramatic spike. It aligned, quietly but decisively. Designers began working with it differently, leaning into its identity instead of forcing it into traditional settings. Lighter metals, open structures, pieces that allowed the stone to breathe, the same way the ocean does. And within a relatively short span, Larimar changed category, from something people happened to buy to something they chose to own. That shift is subtle, but in markets it's everything. Because once a stone becomes a deliberate choice, it no longer depends on context to be valued. It carries its own. Larimar didn't become more rare. It became more understood. And when understanding spreads fast enough, value can feel like it appeared overnight. There's always something that doesn't stand out at first, until one day it suddenly makes perfect sense. Because sometimes the fastest way for a gemstone to rise in value is not to change what it is, but to finally be seen for what it was all along. Ranked 8th, Ammolite. When a fossil crossed into value, place it next to diamonds, sapphires, or emeralds, and something feels off. Not because it lacks color. If anything, it has too much of it. Reds, greens, golds, shifting across the surface in thin, layered flashes. Not the kind of color that reflects cleanly, but the kind that seems to move, like oil drifting across water. It doesn't behave like light bouncing off a surface. It behaves like something happening inside it. And yet, for most of its history, none of that translated into value. Because this material didn't come from the same story. It wasn't formed under pressure deep within the Earth's crust. It didn't grow as a crystal. It didn't follow the structure that defines most gemstones. What existed instead was the preserved shell of an ancient ammonite, compressed, mineralized, and left behind over millions of years. Scientifically fascinating, commercially uncertain. In the world of minerals and fossils, that uncertainty matters. Categories define expectations, and expectations define price. Ammolite existed in a space where it could be admired, but not fully trusted as something that belonged in fine jewelry. It was too fragile, too inconsistent, too far outside the rules. So it stayed where it was understood, until it didn't. At some point, Ammolite began appearing somewhere new, not in natural history collections, but in gemstone displays. Not labeled as a specimen, but as a material to be worn. That shift didn't happen all at once, but once it started, it moved quickly, because placement changes perception. The same surface that looked like a fossil under one kind of lighting began to look like something else entirely under another. Mounted, stabilized, protected, its weaknesses were no longer the focus. Its visual behavior was, and that behavior was hard to ignore. Unlike most gemstones, Ammolite doesn't rely on clarity or cut to create impact. It creates it through layering, thin films of color interacting in ways that feel less controlled but more alive. It doesn't try to be perfect, it creates presence. Once that quality was seen in the right context, the comparison changed. It was no longer being measured against fossils. It was being measured against value. And when that happens, the market doesn't adjust slowly. It reclassifies. Pieces that would have been passed over began to be selected. Not because they became rarer overnight, but because they were now part of a different conversation. A higher one. Design adapted, techniques improved, doublets, backings, protective layers, solutions that allowed the material to survive long enough to be appreciated. And with that, Ammolite crossed a line that most materials never do, from something that didn't belong to something that defined its own place. Seen something like this behind glass before, and then again later, somewhere it didn't used to be? Because sometimes value doesn't come from changing the object. It comes from changing where it's allowed to exist. Rank 7. Zultanite, the gemstone that was named into value. Put it under one light, and it looks soft green. Move it, and it turns champagne. Shift again, and a faint pink begins to appear. Nothing about it feels extreme. And that's exactly what makes it unusual, because most gemstones that command attention do so immediately. They flash, they sparkle, they announce themselves. This one doesn't. It changes quietly, subtly enough that many people miss it the first time. For years, that subtlety kept it in the background. Known mineralogically as diaspore, it existed in collections and small markets without a strong identity. It had the properties, it had the color change behavior, but it didn't have something far more important, a name people could remember. And in the gemstone world, names are not labels, they are signals. At some point, that changed. The material began appearing under a different name, Zultanite. Not a scientific term, but a crafted identity. Something that sounded intentional, exclusive, tied to origin, to narrative, to a specific place rather than a generic category. Nothing about the stone itself had changed, but the way it was introduced had. Suddenly, it wasn't just a color-changing mineral, it was a named gemstone. And that distinction carries weight, because once a stone has a name that feels complete, it becomes easier to position, easier to market, easier to desire. The hesitation disappears, the explanation shortens, recognition accelerates. Zultanite moved quickly after that, not through mass exposure, but through controlled visibility, limited sourcing, consistent presentation, a narrative that stayed intact no matter where the stone appeared. Every piece reinforced the same idea. This is rare, this is specific, this is intentional. And when consistency meets scarcity, value responds. Design followed the identity, settings that emphasized its shifting tones rather than overpowering them. Lighting that revealed change instead of hiding it. Everything worked toward making the behavior of the stone feel deliberate. And once that perception locks in, the market doesn't question it. It accepts it. Zultanite didn't explode into value the way some discoveries do. It moved differently, more quietly, but just as decisively. From a mineral few could name to a gemstone people began asking for. That transition can feel almost invisible while it's happening, until one day the price reflects it, and by then the shift is already complete. Heard a stone called diaspora before, and then noticed how different it sounds when it's called something else? Because in rare cases, value doesn't come from what a gemstone does. It comes from what it's called. Ranked 6th. Sphene, the stone that outshines expectations. Look at it under the right light, and something doesn't add up. The flashes are too intense, too broken apart, too exaggerated. What appears isn't a clean sparkle, it's a burst of color, splitting and scattering in ways that feel almost excessive. Reds separate from greens, yellows stretch into flashes that seem larger than the stone itself. And for anyone familiar with gemstones, that raises a quiet question. Why isn't this everywhere? Because on paper it should be. Sphene, also known as titanite, has a property that sounds almost impossible when first heard. Its dispersion, the ability to split white light into spectral colors, can exceed that of diamond. In controlled conditions, it can produce more fire than one of the most recognized gemstones in the world. And yet, it isn't treated that way. For years, it remained in the margins. Not because it lacked visual impact, but because it lacked reliability. Sphene is softer than many traditional gemstones. It requires careful cutting. It doesn't tolerate wear the way diamonds or sapphires do. And in a market that values durability as much as beauty, that limitation matters. So it was overlooked, not dismissed, but set aside, until the focus shifted. At some point, attention moved away from what gemstones could endure and toward what they could deliver. Performance under light became a category of its own, and suddenly Sphene fit perfectly into it. Collectors began noticing what had always been there, but rarely emphasized. That intense, almost fragmented fire, not clean, not controlled, but alive in a way that felt different from the precision of diamond brilliance. It didn't compete by being better in every category. It stood out by being exceptional in one, and that's often enough. Within a relatively short span, Sphene moved from a specialist curiosity into a stone that began appearing in conversations about optical performance. Not widely, but consistently enough to matter. Design adapted carefully. Pieces were created for viewing rather than daily wear. Settings protected the edges. Lighting became part of the presentation, not just an afterthought. And with that, perception began to shift. Because once a stone is recognized for doing something others can't, even if only under certain conditions, its value recalibrates, not across the entire market, but within the part that's paying attention. Sphene didn't become valuable because it replaced diamonds. It became valuable because it revealed something unexpected. That brilliance isn't the only way to capture light, and sometimes the stones that perform the most are the ones people weren't looking at. Ever seen a stone throw off color like that in person and wondered why it isn't talked about more? Because in rare cases, value doesn't follow what's most durable. It follows what's hardest to ignore. Ranked 5th, Hackmanite, the stone that doesn't forget light. Turn off the UV light, and it should go back to normal. That's how most fluorescent minerals behave. They react, they glow, and the moment the light disappears, the effect ends. Temporary, predictable, easy to understand. Hackmanite doesn't follow that rule. Expose it to ultraviolet light, and it shifts, often from pale tones into deeper purples or pinks. But what makes it different isn't the change itself. It's what happens after. The color doesn't disappear immediately. It lingers, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer. As if the stone holds on to the light it just experienced and releases it slowly on its own terms. This behavior has a name, tenebrescence. But for most people encountering it for the first time, it doesn't feel like a scientific phenomenon. It feels like a mistake, because stones aren't supposed to remember anything. And for a long time, that's exactly how Hackmanite was treated. Not as a centerpiece, not as a gemstone with clear market identity, but as a curiosity, something shown in demonstrations, passed around in small circles, appreciated for what it could do, but not fully integrated into how value is normally assigned. It didn't fit the categories. Too reactive, too unusual, too difficult to explain in a single glance. So it stayed on the edges until attention shifted, not toward perfection, but toward behavior. As more collectors began exploring phenomena rather than just appearance, Hackmanite started to stand out. Not because it was the brightest or the rarest in a traditional sense, but because it did something that broke expectation. It didn't just respond to light, it carried the response forward. And that subtle delay, the gap between cause and effect, became the entire point. Once that was recognized, the way it was presented changed. No longer just shown under UV and dismissed, it was demonstrated as a sequence. Light on, transformation, light off, persistence, a process, something to experience, not just observe. And with that shift, perception followed. Because when a stone becomes something people interact with, rather than just look at, its value moves differently. Hackmanite didn't suddenly flood the market. It didn't undergo a discovery that changed supply. What changed was the level of attention it received from those who value phenomena over tradition. And in that space, it found its place quickly, from overlooked curiosity to something that felt hard to explain away. Watch something change and then stay changed longer than expected, because sometimes what makes a gemstone valuable isn't how it looks in a moment, but what it continues to do after the moment passes. Ranked fourth, Serendibite. The moment rarity became visible. For years it wasn't missing, it was simply unseen. Serendibite existed in the record, cataloged, noted, technically known, but knowing something exists and actually seeing it in a way the market can respond to are two very different things. Because rarity on its own doesn't create value, visibility does, and Serendibite had almost none of it. Early specimens were limited, often opaque, and rarely suitable for cutting. They lived in collections, behind labels, understood by specialists, but disconnected from any real demand. There was no consistent supply, no clear way to present it, nothing for the market to recognize and respond to. So it remained what it had always been, extremely rare and effectively irrelevant. That's the part most people don't expect, because in theory, rarity should drive value. But in practice, rarity without visibility creates silence. No buyers, no comparisons, no price. Serendibite sat in that silence for a long time, until something shifted. Not a discovery of a new element, not a sudden increase in abundance, but the appearance of something the market could finally use. Face-table material. Clear enough, stable enough, presentable enough to move beyond classification and into circulation. And once that threshold was crossed, everything that had been invisible became measurable. Cut stones began to appear. Not many, but enough. Enough for comparison. Enough for collectors to take notice. Enough for the first real conversations about value to begin. And once a gemstone enters that stage, where it can be seen, evaluated, and owned, the adjustment happens quickly. Because now rarity has context. Serendibite didn't gradually become valuable over time. It arrived in the market as something already rare. And that creates a different kind of shift. There's no slow build, no early stage where prices climb step by step. Instead, the first real appearances set the tone. Collectors don't ask, is this worth more? They ask, how often will this appear again? And that question changes behavior. Acquisition becomes immediate. Hesitation disappears. Because when something has been invisible for so long, the moment it becomes accessible feels temporary, even if it isn't. That perception alone can move value faster than the scarcity ever could. Serendibite didn't change its nature. It changed its state, from something known in theory to something encountered in reality. Ever notice how something only feels rare once it finally shows up where people can actually see it? Because in the end, value doesn't come from what exists. It comes from what becomes visible. Ranked third, Taaffeite, the gem that was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't discovered in the ground. It was discovered in a collection, sitting among stones that had already been sorted, labeled, and supposedly understood. Nothing about it looked out of place. The color matched. The cut made sense. The assumption was simple. This is just another Sphene. And that assumption held, right up until it didn't, because one detail refused to align. Under closer examination, the optical behavior didn't match what Sphene should produce. Subtle at first, easy to overlook, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. The stone wasn't behaving incorrectly, it was behaving differently, and that difference forced a second look, then a third, then a realization that doesn't happen often in the gemstone world. This wasn't a miscut stone. It wasn't a variation. It wasn't even a rare type of something known. It was something else entirely. A new mineral, hidden inside a category that had already been closed. Taaffeite wasn't found. It was recognized. And that distinction changes everything. Because most gemstones build value through discovery. Something is found, introduced, then slowly understood. Taaffeite reversed that process. It existed inside the system first, and only later revealed that it didn't belong there, which means for an unknown amount of time, it had already been bought, sold, and categorized incorrectly. That realization alone created tension in the market. How many more were out there? How long had they been misidentified? And more importantly, how many had already passed through unnoticed? Suddenly, what seemed familiar became uncertain. Spinel parcels were no longer just Spinel. Collections were re-examined. Dealers looked twice at stones they would have moved without hesitation, because now there was a possibility, small but real, that something far more valuable was hiding in plain sight. And when that kind of doubt enters a system, value moves quickly. Taaffeite didn't need marketing. It didn't need a story to be built around it. Its story was the disruption. A gemstone that wasn't where it was supposed to be until someone realized it. From that moment, it shifted almost instantly, from overlooked to extraordinary. Not because supply changed, but because understanding did. The same physical object, seen through a different lens, became something entirely new in the eyes of the market. And that's the kind of shift that doesn't take time. It takes recognition. Looked at something for years, and then one detail suddenly made it feel completely different? Because sometimes the rarest things aren't hidden underground. They're already in front of us, just labeled the wrong way. Ranked second, Musgravite, the gem that had no price until it did. Try to assign a value to something that almost never appears, not rare in the usual sense, but absent. For a long time, Musgravite existed in that space. Documented, yes, known to science. But in the marketplace, it was nearly invisible. There were no consistent sales, no reference prices, no stable comparisons. Without those, value doesn't just stay low. It fails to form at all. Because markets rely on repetition. A stone appears. It's sold. It appears again. A pattern builds. Buyers gain confidence. Prices begin to anchor. Over time, value becomes something that can be discussed, negotiated, expected. Musgravite had none of that. It didn't circulate. It didn't repeat. It didn't establish a pattern. So for years, it remained outside the system that defines worth. Not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked presence. And then something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. A few faceted stones began to appear. Verified, documented. Real examples that could be seen, compared, and, most importantly, acquired. Still incredibly limited, but no longer theoretical. That shift seems small, but in a market built on visibility and comparison, it's everything. Because the moment a second example appears after the first, a pattern begins. And with pattern comes expectation. Collectors started to pay attention, not just to the stone itself, but to the fact that it could now be part of a sequence. However rare that sequence might be, it existed. And that was enough to trigger something the market hadn't been able to do before: assign value. The first prices weren't gentle. They couldn't be. There was no history to reference, no gradual build. The stone entered the market not at the bottom, but at the edge, where rarity meets uncertainty. And in that space, decisions are made quickly. Because hesitation has a cost. If something appears once, it might not appear again. If it appears twice, the window might already be closing. That perception accelerates behavior. Musgravite didn't rise through levels. It stepped into value. From something that couldn't be priced to something that demanded one immediately. And once that threshold is crossed, it doesn't reverse. Because the hardest part of value isn't increasing it, it's creating it in the first place. Tried to put a value on something and realize there was nothing to compare it to? Because in rare cases, the shift isn't from low to high, it's from undefined to undeniable. In first place, Grandidierite, the moment value had to be rewritten. There are stones that become valuable over time, and then there are stones that force the idea of value to change. Grandidierite belongs to the second kind. For most of its known history, it didn't exist in a form the market could use. The mineral itself was documented, recognized, cataloged, understood in theory. But what existed were opaque specimens, solid, dense, visually limited. Nothing that could be cut into a gemstone people would seek. So it remained where it fit best, in collections, in records, in knowledge, but not in demand. And for a long time, that was enough. Because without transparency, without light moving through the material, there is no way for a gemstone to enter the kind of conversation that drives value. It can be rare, even extraordinary, but it stays outside the system. Grandidierite stayed outside until something appeared that wasn't supposed to. Not a new mineral, not a variation, but a different state of the same material. Transparent, clear enough for light to pass through, clean enough to be cut. Suddenly the color, deep blue-green, somewhere between ocean and glass, was no longer trapped inside the stone. It was revealed, and that single change did more than improve appearance. It unlocked the category, because now Grandidierite could be seen the way gemstones are meant to be seen. Not as objects, but as interaction with light, depth, movement, subtle shifts in tone that only appear when the material allows it. Everything that had been theoretical became real, and when that happens with something already rare, the shift is immediate. There is no slow introduction, no period of adjustment, because the moment a stone crosses from uncuttable to collectible, it doesn't enter the market at the bottom. It arrives at the edge, where rarity, novelty, and uncertainty collide. Collectors don't wait for confirmation. They respond to possibility. And in that moment, value doesn't build. It resets. Grandidierite didn't become more abundant. It didn't change composition. It didn't follow a path the market could predict. It simply revealed a version of itself that had never been seen before. And that was enough to rewrite how it was judged. From something known to something wanted. From something studied to something pursued. And that shift, sudden, irreversible, and difficult to explain in traditional terms, is what overnight value actually looks like at its highest level. Not an increase, a redefinition. When something finally shows up the way it was always supposed to, people react fast. Because in the end, the rarest change isn't in the stone. It's in the moment people realize they've been looking at it the wrong way all along. None of these stones changed overnight, not in the way most people expect. Their structure stayed the same. Their origin didn't shift. Nothing about them suddenly became more real. What changed was the moment they were finally understood. And once that happens, value doesn't move slowly. It moves all at once. Because markets don't wait for certainty. They react to recognition, a name that sticks, a property that stands out, a version of the stone that finally makes sense. And from that point on, the question is no longer, what is this worth? It becomes, how did this go unnoticed for so long? That's the pattern behind every stone in this list. Not discovery, not hype, but a shift in perception, strong enough to reset everything that came before it. Which raises a quieter question. If value can change this quickly, without the stone itself changing at all, then how many others are still being seen the wrong way? Somewhere right now there's a stone sitting in plain sight, still waiting for that moment. Because in the end, the rarest thing isn't the gemstone, it's the timing when people finally recognize it.